At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on a quiet Sunday in January, a park ranger stepped out of a visitor center in the mountains of southeastern Arizona and walked toward a trail he had walked 100 times before. He never walked back. No scream was heard, no struggle was reported. No one raised an alarm, because for the first 2.5 hours there was nothing to be alarmed about. He'd told a seasonal coworker to lock up if he wasn't back by 4:30. That was routine. Rangers stepped out to patrol trails all the time. But 4:30 came, and then 5, and the man who had spent years falling in love with every canyon and arroyo of Chiricahua National Monument did not come home. His name was Paul Fugate. He was 41 years old, and what happened to him in those missing hours has never been explained. Not by his family, not by a small army of investigators, and not by the mountains that swallowed him whole. Paul was the oldest of 6 children, and by every account, he had found exactly the life he wanted. He wasn't just employed at Chiricahua, he was devoted to it. 12,000 acres of volcanic rock spires, hidden washes, and narrow canyon trails, and Paul knew the place the way most people know their own backyard. That Sunday started like any other shift. He was working the visitor center. In the early afternoon, he decided to walk out and check one of the nature trails near a historic property inside the monument called Faraway Ranch. It was routine maintenance, the kind of walk he'd done countless times. He told the seasonal employee working with him that day to close up if he wasn't back in a couple of hours. He never came back. When the center closed and Paul still hadn't returned, concern started to build. By that evening, it had turned into something else entirely, a search. Rangers, sheriff's deputies, search and rescue volunteers. They fanned out across some of the most unforgiving terrain in the state. Chiricahua isn't a gentle park. It's a maze of steep canyons and dry riverbeds, the kind of landscape where a single misstep could hide a person forever. They searched for days, then weeks. They covered the same ground more than once, hoping they'd missed something the first time. They found nothing. Not his uniform, not his boots, not the green down parka he'd been wearing, not his radio. No body. And here's the detail that turns this from a tragic accident into something far darker. Nothing was missing from his life. Nothing was gone from his apartment at the park. Nothing was gone from his house in Tucson. No packed bag. No withdrawn savings. No signs that a man had made a plan to walk away from everything he had. If Paul Fugate left that mountain on his own 2 feet, he left with absolutely nothing. And if someone took him, they left behind almost nothing too. Almost. Because there were 2 pieces of the puzzle that investigators couldn't ignore. 2 threads that, decades later, still refused to add up to a clean answer. The first came from another park employee who told investigators he'd seen tire marks near Faraway Ranch, the kind you'd expect from a vehicle spinning out on a primitive dirt road. Near those tracks, he said, the ground looked disturbed, like something, or someone, had been dragged. The second piece is stranger, and it's the detail that has haunted this case for 46 years. A different employee came forward and said that on the afternoon Fugate disappeared, he saw him in a pickup truck, not alone, flanked by 2 men he didn't recognize, with Fugate positioned between them like he wasn't entirely there by choice. The truck was moving away from the monument and moving fast. Investigators, hoping to sharpen the memory, had the witness put under hypnosis. Under that state, more detail emerged. He described one man in a green jacket, the other in a red, black, and white plaid shirt, heavier build, a rough beard, somewhere in his 30s. And he said Paul Fugate looked, in his words, sad and dejected. It's a chilling image. A man who loved this land more than almost anything, being driven out of it against his will, and looking like he already knew he wasn't coming back. But there's a problem. Hypnosis-assisted memory has never held up well under scrutiny, not in courtrooms, not in serious investigations. Was this witness recalling something real, or reconstructing something his mind filled in under pressure, months or years after the fact? Nobody has ever been able to say for certain. And that uncertainty opened the door to something almost as disturbing as the disappearance itself. A fight over what actually happened that would tear through Paul's own family for decades. The lead investigator originally assigned to the case reached a conclusion early on, and he never really let go of it. He believed Paul Fugate had simply left, walked out on his job, his marriage, his life, and started over somewhere else, under a new name, with someone new. It wasn't a theory pulled from nowhere. Paul's marriage to his wife, Dodie, was unconventional. It was an open arrangement, one she'd known about and accepted for years. And at the time he disappeared, Paul had been seeing a seasonal employee at the park, a woman who, investigators later learned, was pregnant. To the lead investigator, that was enough. He told reporters he believed Paul was out there somewhere, quote, living with a paramour, very healthy, and that finding him simply wasn't a priority. For his wife, that theory wasn't just insulting. It was devastating in a very literal sense. Because the National Park Service refused to formally declare Paul deceased, Dodie was denied his survivor's benefits and his pension. For 6 years, she fought an agency that seemed to believe her husband was simply a man who didn't want to be found. She never accepted it. She said it made no sense. That Paul had built the exact life he wanted at that monument, and there was no version of him choosing to abandon it. In 1986, 6 years after he vanished, a joint review by a National Park Service investigator and an Arizona state investigator finally re-examined everything, and they reached a different conclusion. There was no credible evidence, they found, that Paul Fugate had left of his own free will. He was presumed dead. Dodie finally received the benefits she'd been fighting for. But presumed dead isn't the same as solved, and the years that followed only added more competing theories, not fewer. One theory points to the terrain itself. Chiricahua sits close to remote stretches of the borderlands, and investigators have long suspected the area around Faraway Ranch was used for smuggling, drugs, sometimes people, moving quietly through the canyons. If Paul, on a routine patrol, walked directly into an operation like that in progress, he wouldn't have needed to do anything wrong. He would have just needed to be there. Seen the wrong truck, recognized the wrong face. Investigators found something odd that seemed to support it, a land purchase made in the area, just 1 month after Paul disappeared. It was suspicious enough to look into. It was never conclusively tied to his case. Then, years later, came a letter. It arrived from inside an Arizona state prison, written by an inmate who claimed direct knowledge of what happened. He said he knew of a narcotics operation gone wrong in the park, and that a specific fellow inmate had helped, in his words, knock off a park ranger who'd gotten in the way. Investigators who reviewed the letter noted something unsettling: the level of detail. The correspondent knew the case intimately. He knew how to spell the name of the monument correctly, a word most people stumble over. But a letter from a prison, secondhand and unverifiable, isn't proof. It's one more thread in a case already knotted with them. And that leaves a third, quieter theory, one that circles back to the family itself. Investigators who've re-examined the case in more recent years haven't been able to fully rule out the people closest to Paul. His open marriage, the pregnant employee he was seeing, the inconsistencies some investigators say they've found in his wife's own retelling of events over 4 decades of interviews. None of it amounts to an accusation. But none of it has ever been closed off either. So here's where the case stands 46 years later. No body has ever been found. Not in the visitor center's own backyard, not across 12,000 acres of canyon that have been searched again and again. The National Park Service has raised its reward to $60,000. Investigators who've picked up the file in later decades have called it, more than once, a case that should be solvable. And Paul Fugate's wife, now in her 80s, still searches the hills of Cochise County looking for anything. A bone, a boot, a single answer to the question she's been asking since 1980. Where is Paul Fugate? Not a question anymore. After 46 years, it reads more like a demand, one the mountains have never answered.